Kierkegaard in 19 minutes. In this video, I'd like to talk about the work of the early mid-19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who is usually credited as being the grandfather of the entire existentialist movement. But before we get into the details of Kierkegaard's philosophy, let's take a minute to characterize it in very general terms. First, Kierkegaard's philosophy is very theistic, and more specifically, very Christian. So much so that he might well be considered more of a Christian theologian than a philosopher. Second, Kierkegaard's philosophy tends to be very individualistic. Third, it's good to know up front that Kierkegaard frequently employs what's sometimes known as indirect communication, which consists of devices such as sarcasm, irony, pseudonyms, metaphors, evocative stories, etc. This tends to make reading Kierkegaard somewhat challenging, since his real point is often the exact opposite of what he seems to be saying. But the rationale for this is that he wants to draw the reader toward having an actual experience, which of course demands a much deeper, much more thoughtful level of engagement with his texts and ideas. Okay, now that we've characterized Kierkegaard's work in very general terms, let's look at some of his more specific ideas. One good place to start is with his distinction between two kinds of truth, objective truth and subjective truth. For Kierkegaard, objective truth has to do with truth the way we normally think of it. For instance, truth is a product of empirical observation, such as in the case of the natural sciences. Or truth is governed by abstract disciplines like those of formal logic and mathematics. One thing to notice about objective truths is how much they're governed by consensus. For instance, we commonly regard E equals mc squared, or PV equals nRT, as being true first because many expert scientists have come to a consensus that they are indeed true assertions, and then because they were consequently propagated across the social terrain to form a part of our larger cultural consensus about what's true. However, some kinds of truth are much more individual and personal than that. There are some things in life that we just have to experience firsthand before they can appear to us as truths at all. To paraphrase Louis Armstrong a little, if you actually have to ask what jazz is, then you won't understand the answer. In other words, for the truth of jazz to appear to us, we have to have at least some experiential reference point in our lives to relate to it. Without that, jazz will only seem like incomprehensible nonsense to us, not a worthwhile musical truth. For Kierkegaard, most of life's really important truths are like that. They're subjective truths rather than objective truths. In other words, a product of individual experience rather than consensus based upon empirical observation and/or abstract logic. Basically, objective truth is a great paradigm for doing chemistry or physics, but it's a very poor paradigm for fathoming the human soul, or for cultivating our capacity for wisdom. Let's look at a concrete example of the difference between objective and subjective truth: our mortality. The question is, how do we really know we're going to die? Well, from the perspective of objective truth, we know we're going to die because we empirically observe that all human beings eventually die, and that we ourselves are human beings. Logically, then, what applies to all human beings would also apply to us. The objective truth of our mortality is consequently grounded in a combination of empirical observation and logical inference. However, the subjective truth of our mortality is something very different, something much more personal and much more palpable. For mortality to appear to us as a subjective truth, we actually have to experience how death runs through every moment of our lives, like an unsettling undercurrent drawing us ever closer to the distant horizon, toward our ultimate undoing and dissolution. We have to feel, at least now and then, that cold and very intimate impress of finality upon our souls, to feel ourselves both giving birth and dying as we move from moment to moment. But to experience the truth of our mortality that way is much more personally challenging than simply accepting it as an objective truth. To experience mortality as a subjective truth means being willing to expand the outer perimeter of what death even means to us, and simultaneously what life means to us. For Kierkegaard, the truth of religious life works much the same way. Faith in God isn't a matter of accumulating some combination of correct empirical observations and/or logical arguments, because the truth of religious faith is a subjective affair, something like appreciating jazz or feeling the reality of our mortality or falling in love. In other words, something we have to experience firsthand for it to count as a truth at all. This may seem like an obvious point, but actually its implications can quickly sort out several vexing conundrums that arise today. For instance, from this perspective, most of the disputes that commonly arise between a secular scientific worldview and its religious counterpart are really rooted in differences in people's experiential reference points, and consequently differences in their personal perceptions about how truth works and which truths should matter. Which is why these kinds of emotionally charged squabbles almost never change anyone's mind about anything. It's because people are trying to resolve by debate an issue that's really rooted in experience. A further implication is that religious faith isn't actually a matter of knowing anything or of proving or disproving that God exists, since knowing and the certainty that goes along with it are elements of the objective view of truth, which is not really what religious faith is about in the first place. Like all of the rest of life's subjective truths, faith in God is what takes over when all the world's objective evidence has reached its outermost boundary. And the reality is that our objective knowledge of things always has its limitations. Consequently, religious faith is actually in an intimate relation with doubt and uncertainty. For Kierkegaard, this is part of what differentiates what he calls a knight of faith from a mere religious zealot or fanatic. A religious zealot claims to know that God exists as if it were a kind of objective truth, which is tantamount to not having religious faith in any genuine sense at all. In contrast, a knight of faith believes that God exists and throws the entire weight of his or her existence in that direction, against the backdrop of all of the reasons to doubt it. Consequently, for Kierkegaard, doubt is not a diminishment of religious faith, but is actually integral to its value and its power as a form of subjective truth, which is part of the reason why religious life requires passion and commitment, a kind of passionate inwardness, as he says, rather than just a smug, comfortable sense of superiority and just being right. Another implication here is that because Christian faith is really about a kind of interior, subjective experiential truth, it's not actually visible from the outside. For instance, one can look, sound, and behave exactly like a stereotypical Christian and still be missing the essential inner experiential core of relating to God. For instance, one can easily fall into the trap of thinking oneself as a real Christian just because, well, it's how one grew up, or just because one is conforming to the dictates of the larger culture, or just because one hasn't seriously considered any alternatives, or just out of blind mechanical habit. Similarly, one can go through all the motions of attending church regularly, reading the Bible every day, studying theology, and even saying grace before every meal, and still be missing the essential experiential character of Christianity. The unsettling implication here is that not everyone who claims to be a Christian or who thinks of himself that way actually is one. In fact, probably very few of us are. Most of us are probably just going along with the herd, just conforming and obeying, just part of Christendom. Basically, the Christian mob, as Kierkegaard sarcastically puts it. But then, what are most of our lives really about for Kierkegaard? Well, for him, the unflattering answer is that most of us are probably simply obeying the dictates of pleasure and pain, especially in the form of trying to maximize our happiness and minimize our unhappiness. Kierkegaard calls this pattern of life the aesthetic mode of existence, and for most of us, it's probably tempting to think that this is the ultimate goal of our lives, to be mostly in a pleasurable state of happiness. However, for Kierkegaard, there's a lot more to life than that. The reason why maximizing our pleasure and minimizing our pain is not a complete answer to the riddle of our existence is that life's pleasures very quickly lose their charm when we repeat them enough. Think of buying something that you really wanted for a long time. A new pair of shoes, maybe. So you save your money and eventually you experience that warm, almost visceral thrill of finally owning them. And that thrill lasts a little while, maybe a week or two. But then, after a few months, it's just another pair of shoes. Not particularly exciting, just there. So where did all that pleasure go? Well, it went where all pleasures go eventually. When we repeat them often enough, we naturally become bored with them. At this point, probably most of us look for a new pleasure, one to replace the one that used to excite us. Maybe we take up binge watching lots of TV. Or maybe we collect sexual experiences the way some people collect postage stamps. Or maybe we become a connoisseur of fine cognac. But over time, the same basic thing will eventually happen with those pursuits too. Through repetition, we'll eventually exhaust their allure and become bored with them too. Now, imagine that at some point in your life, you were to realize that it's not actually your shoes or your TV or your sex life that's boring you. What's really boring you is the entire hamster wheel pattern of chasing after the next pleasure, depleting it, and then chasing after a new one. Blah, 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 ad infinitum. At that point, you might be ready for an entirely new paradigm for your life, one that lies beyond the whole circular trap of always trying to obtain the next pleasure and or avoid the next pain. For Kierkegaard, that next pattern would be what he calls the ethical mode of existence, and its definitive feature is that life becomes mostly about doing what's right for its own sake, especially in the form of obeying the dictates of secular ethics. Examples of this are definitely harder to find in our modern world, but a fairly common one would take the form of being a parent, at least in the genuine sense. To be a parent in the genuine sense means that your main pattern of life is no longer about maximizing your own pleasure, but about doing what's right for your children. However, for Kierkegaard, the ethical mode of existence is not the final answer to life's riddle either. The final answer must issue from life's furthest, most distant shores. And of course, for him, that would be the religious mode of existence, which is governed by obedience to God rather than secular ethics. However, the question of whether we're really obeying God or secular ethics can get tricky, especially since the two often overlap. So, for Kierkegaard, the most important situation in this regard would be the one that puts the two directly at odds with each other, because it's only that kind of situation that really differentiates obedience to God from just obeying the law. And for Kierkegaard, the archetype for that kind of situation is described in the Bible, in Genesis 22, where God commands Abraham to make a human sacrifice of his son Isaac. Secular ethics would, of course, tell us that it's wrong to kill one's own children, and yet Abraham is commanded by God to do just that. So, which does he obey? Of course, in the biblical account, Abraham does indeed start to make a human sacrifice out of Isaac, but is stopped by God in the nick of time. Consequently, Abraham is, for Kierkegaard, the exemplar par excellence of the religious mode of existence, because his obedience to God and his faith in God were so powerful that they even eclipsed the deep ethical mandate not to kill his own children. The movement from the ethical mode to the religious mode, exemplified by Abraham, involves a definitive leap of faith that Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Since this leap of faith is a form of subjective truth and consequently isn't determined by logic or empirical observation, Kierkegaard claims that it occurs ultimately by virtue of the absurd, where absurdity here does not constitute a diminishment of faith, but a positive attribute of its formation. Finally, let's take a look at one of Kierkegaard's most interesting and prescient psychological insights, the concept of dread, or anxiety, or angst, as it's variously translated. Probably the first thing to know about Kierkegaard's analysis of dread is that he regards it as an ontological category. In other words, a central and inescapable constituent of existence as such. It's not just that we occasionally have particular experiences of dread. The deeper reality is that these concrete experiences are indicators of the fact that existence itself is structured that way. To exist is to be in a state of dread, and our particular experiences are simply making that obvious. But how is this so? Let's examine dread a little further. Kierkegaard describes dread, somewhat opaquely, as a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy. However, this might be rendered more lucidly as a desire for what we fear and a fear of what we desire. Or perhaps an attraction to what repels us and a repulsion toward what attracts us. Because this idea is somewhat counterintuitive with respect to how we usually think about the relationship between desire and fear, or attraction and repulsion, probably the best way into it is to follow Kierkegaard by looking at a concrete example. Have you ever wondered why so many of us are afraid of heights? Why is it much easier for most of us to stand on the edge of a 6-inch platform than on the edge of an open 100-foot elevator shaft? After all, in both instances, we can be reasonably sure that we won't fall simply because we lack the physical coordination to keep standing where we are. So the difference isn't really about the physical danger of falling. The difference in scariness must have something to do with us, with our psychological being rather than our physical being. For Kierkegaard, the reason why it's scary to stand on the edge of an open elevator shaft is first that some part of us knows that it's within the range of our freedom to jump in and annihilate ourselves. So, at one level, dread has to do with the reality of our basic human freedom, which is really nothing more than part of our existence. So, it turns out that the real locus of our dread is our existence itself. But the really scary thing is not just that we're free enough to destroy ourselves at any moment. The really scary thing is that some part of us might actually want to do that. In other words, our desire is not nearly as straightforward as it seems at first. It's not only about being attracted to the things that make us happy, that benefit our lives, etc. There's also a dark side to our desires and fears. At some scary level that's hard even to admit, we also desire our own dissolution and destruction. This is a psychologically significant insight that Freud was to reformulate almost 100 years later in the form of the Thanatos drive. And it's significant because it helps make sense of a lot of otherwise puzzling self-destructive behaviors, such as those having to do with addictions, self-sabotage of various sorts, why people stay in recurrently abusive relationships, etc. So, all in all, Kierkegaard's philosophy constitutes first a powerful defense of Christianity and the value of religious life more generally in today's increasingly secular world, but also a deep critique of how we characteristically fall short of the religious life to which we aspire. It also contains a wealth of early psychological insights, especially into the darker and more difficult regions of the human psyche. However, perhaps his greatest contribution lies in the fact that his work served as the principal inspiration and springboard for the entire movement of modern existentialism, which flourished for more than a century after his death. And that's Kierkegaard in 19 minutes.